Okay, so we start looking at the paradox. I'll just say a couple of things. If you haven't read the paper recommended for this week, it's in the study guide, page 94 to 97. It's a very short paper. It's an exquisite piece of philosophy. You know, in terms of someone who has knowledge of and control over the Eastern tradition as well as Western philosophy. So it's just a very nice piece. Sometimes students say, I don't know how to write, what's the expected level? I mean, this is a very good example of how to write philosophy. It's very concise. It's just beautiful. And so even if you haven't read it, I'm not going to say do a show of hands who's done the reading today. If you haven't read it, read it. I'm sure you will enjoy it. The other thing to say is there was a question in the break about references in the expository exercise. Should you use references? Now, the purpose of the expository exercise, the first two exercises, is just to show your understanding of, that's what the expository exercise, understanding of the material, understanding of what is in the study guide. For this particular exercise, I'm not expecting you to go and read other things. There is more than enough material in the study guide, in the handouts for you to be able to do this exercise. That said, it is a good idea to learn that you reference everything that you use. So I would suggest that no matter where you're taking the ideas from, whether it's from the handout, that's acceptable, whether it's from the study guide, but just make sure you do proper references. So, let's say the reading for today is what you're going to use, some of that Chakrabarti paper. So you say, you don't have to go and find the original source. Say Chakrabarti, this is the title of the paper, reprinted in the study guide from page such and such to such and such, reprinted in the Indian Philosophy Study Guide, right? So that's quite acceptable, but make sure you use that. For the expository exercises, if I may add, try and write in your own words. As far as possible, please do not use quotes, because what I want to test here, what I'm looking forward to, is your understanding of what is going on in this course. So try and write as far as possible in your own words. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask me, send me an email, or any other thing. Okay, so on to the paradox. So as I said, there are two versions of the paradox. The first we've often covered, the idea, and that's the one that Chakrabarti. So Chakrabarti is the essential reading for this week. The other kind of version of the paradox, as well as the solution to the paradox, is discussed in the Framrin paper. It's a paper by a guy called Christopher Framrin, and it's on your resources, under resources on Moodle. So if you were writing an essay on this topic, it might be useful to read that as well. So Chakrabarti does a very good job of showing that this tension is real in the Gita. Duty for the sake of duty and duty for the sake of moksha do not fit well. The idea, he thinks, the trouble is that the notion of desireless action is very difficult to understand. What does it mean to say that we act without any desire, provided we are acting with the desire for moksha? That's the worry. And I think, he does his own translation of a couple of passages of the Gita. This is on page 95, just to bring out the tension very, very clearly. And then goes on to discuss some solutions to the paradox. So let's just look at the two passages. So, the wise ones, endowed with knowledge of equality, give up the results produced by their actions, and thereby they achieve a state free from all sufferings. So we give up the results produced by actions and thereby achieve a state free from all sufferings, being released from the bondage of further births. How is it possible to be assured that the ultimate happiness of absolute freedom from all suffering is going to result from my performance of my duties and yet do them without thinking about any results. You know, how can we even make sense of it? And again, and this is the passage where you get, you know, what is called the ideal of the Gita, Nishkam Karma, chapter 3, number 19. Therefore, you perform your duties in a non-attached manner, because by acting without concern for the results, a man attains ultimate happiness. And this just, even as you read it, you can see there is tension in there. By acting without concern of a result, what you get is ultimate happiness. So how do we resolve this tension? He just quotes these passages to make clear that the tension here is real. The Framrin version of the paradox goes something like this. You know, there the idea is, you know, we are talking about moral action. Moral action is intentional action. And how do we understand the notion of intentional action? We understand it in terms of beliefs and desires. How are intentions formed? This is a bit of theorizing that you get in moral psychology in the West. Intentions are formed in accordance with beliefs and desires. And intentions are what motivate your actions. So think about it in this sort of way. If you are if you're thirsty, you have a desire to quench your thirst, you have a belief, you know, there's a water bottle somewhere, you go and get the water bottle and quench your thirst, right? Or a more, you know, if you have, you know, let's say that you intend to do something to address poverty in the world, well, you have a desire. What does that mean? You have a desire to do something about world poverty. And you have the belief that Oxfam actually does something about world poverty, does something to alleviate world poverty. So what the belief desire pair does, it results in your action that you give money to Oxfam. You want to do something, you believe that this organization does something, you put those two together, you do something for that's what causes your action. And the problem that Framrin raises is if you take away all desires, then how do I motivate action? Desires have this motivating force. You know, we can't be motivated to do anything if our action is completely devoid of desire, which, you know, the sort of the dictum of desireless action. And the Gita says, do action without any desire. Well, if there is no desire at all, you know, we won't be motivated to act. We won't move. If you have no desire, you just sit in one place, right? There's no desire to move. And that's his concern. You can't have, he can't even, you know, make sense of desireless action. There seems to be a problem with desireless action because without desire, we cannot make sense of the agent's action. How can we, you know, explain the agent's action? So let's look at the solutions to each of these in turn. So the first thing that Chakrabarti tries, and I think it's a good idea, is to suggest that what the Gita is really saying, and lots of people in the literature try this solution, what the Gita is really saying, or must be saying, is, you know, the question of interpretation again here, must be saying is that, you know, we only give up certain kinds of desires. You know, it's the bad desires we give up. It's the selfish desires we give up. We can't give up all desires. That's not what, you know, the Nishkama Karma must be saying. It's only, we have to make some kind of distinction between desires, call them bad desires, call them selfish desires. We get rid of those desires. But the point cannot be that we get rid of all desires. Here's another neat idea, neat way of distinguishing between desires. You know, some desires we just happen to have. So just because we have a physical body We have a desire for food, we have a desire for hunger, kind of an organism we are, we have a desire for sex. All these are natural desires. These are desires, you know, we find ourselves with. These are not desires, you know, that we think about. These are what is sometimes called first order desires. These are desires we find ourselves with. And, you know, one of the interpreters says, and again, that reading says, you know, the Gita is not talking about give up your first order desires. I mean, after all, how can you give up first order desires? They're just there because of the physical organism you are. Because what the Gita is talking about is, you know, we look at our set of first order desires. I have a desire for food, I have a desire for water, I have a desire for procreation, you know, all these sorts of things that we have desires for. And the Gita says, given the desires we find ourselves with, we have to think about which desires we want to have. So rather than just thinking about first order desires, we then do this thing. We reflect on our desires and think about which desires we should have and which desires we need to give up. So second order desires is the idea, is the sort of reflection on the first order desires. We find ourselves, you know, and I mean, I just talked about the natural desires, food, water, and procreation. But given the world that we live in, there are lots of other desires that, you know, we find ourselves with. If you go to Chadstone, you'll find yourself with lots of desires that, you know, they're not natural, and, you know, you don't think about them, you know, whether I should want it or not. You just find yourself desiring. And that's the whole point of advertising, right? You look at the TV, and unconsciously, you find yourself having that desire. You don't think about, oh, you know, they're trying to talk me into it. You don't consciously form the desires. It so happens, seeing all those, this is what happens to kids, you know, seeing all those burgers day after day on the TV, the McDonald's and the little toys with it, they just form a desire, you know, to want those things. They look so attractive. I mean, they don't look so good once you actually go inside McDonald's, but on the TV, they look great, right? And so given what we are exposed to, we find ourselves with lots of desires. And one idea in thinking of the distinction between desires is we look at the desires we find ourselves with and reflect which of these desires we are supposed to have, and then give up some desires, and other desires we hold very close to. Those are our values. You know, this is how philosophers talk. Harry Frankfurt is the person who makes this distinction. First order desires are desires you find yourselves with, and then you have a smaller set of second order desires after you've reflected on the first. It's the same desire, but after you've reflected on the first set, you prune it down. You know, I might have a desire to go and get smashed on Monday night, but I don't do it because I know I have to be here Tuesday morning, right? That desire I control. I think about my values. What matters to me is that I, you know, come and do my lecture properly rather than, you know, mumbling something incoherent in class, right? That's what I value, and that's why I make it a point to go to bed on time on Monday. And, you know, all of us do those things. There are things that we value. There are things that we, you know, if you like, animal desires or whatever you call them. First order desires is the term that is used. The second order desires is a smaller set after reflection, and that's our values, and that guides our actions. They're still desires, but that guides our action. So these are various ways of distinguishing between desires and thinking about, you know, the Gita can't be saying, don't have any desires, because without desire, as I said, we won't be able to act. We won't be able to move. The Gita is only saying, don't have bad desires, don't just have first order desires. You know, we need to think about our desires, we need to rationalize and then come up with this considered set. Chakrabarti thinks that that solution is a bad solution. You know, this distinction between desires, which naturally suggests itself, and lots of people in the literature are tempted by it. This is not a good solution. And even people, so here's also an example of in the Hindu literature, they're also aware that, this message of the Gita is paradoxical. So they're also trying to address the issue of nishkam karma by thinking of some kind of distinction between desire. The distinction they make, and it's quoted here on page 95, is, the desire for moksha is desire for the self. All other desires are selfish desires, but the desire for the self is not a bad desire. So here's what they say. So they also say like this: when all desires sealed in the heart disappear, then the mortal individual becomes immortal or free. So how can then, so we think that only someone free from all kinds of desires has the right to get liberated. How then can a kind of desire be an entitling qualification? How can then the desire for moksha be an entitling qualification? The answer is, this is not a problem. This is no defect. In the text, the word desire is used with the intended meaning. So this is, this is what they meant by desire, is desire for objects other than the self. They said you have to give up desire for objects other than the self. Since the desire for moksha is directed towards the pure self, the Hindu idea of pure self, it is a non-desire. So they think the desire for moksha is not even a desire. And the same Upanishad says that to desire the self is to be desireless. So to desire the self is, in fact, desireless. But again, this distinction, Chakrabarti thinks, between two kinds of desires is not a good idea, full stop. And here's the problem. And it's a problem pointed out by the Nyaya philosophers, but also by Kant. So here's what one of the Nyaya thinkers says: we should not seek moksha for the sake of eternal happiness. Why? Otherwise, nurtured by the assurance of permanent happiness, in moksha the demonness of desire, given little scope, will bind the aspirant even to nearer available worldly pleasures, thus throwing his chances of liberation quite far away. Hence, even the smallest room should not be made for any sort of desire. Because the moment you make room for desire, even the smallest room for desire, desire is always, so to say, bound up with happiness. So once you start thinking about making the smallest room for desire, you're doomed. And this is not a point just made by these Nyaya philosophers. This is a point also made by Kant. Kant also has what is called duty for the duty's sake model. So I talked about utilitarian theories. The other important moral theory in the Western philosophical literature is what is called ontological duty. Deontological theories. And that's the important person there, the important figure there is Kant's moral theory. And Kant has the very same model, duty for the sake of duty. Of course, he's not talking about moksha or liberation. He says to be a good moral being, you must do duty for the sake of duty. And this is how Kant also worries about, desire, making room for desire. So, and the point is exactly the same. The smallest room you make for desire, the minute you let happiness comes in, then the only thing that matters, because moksha is ultimate happiness or pleasure, the moment you let that seep in, you will get pulled into wanting other desires, wanting to satisfy other desires which are easy or closer or something. So here's the distinction Kant talks about. This is on page 96. A man can return unread an instructive book which he cannot again obtain in order not to miss a hunt. He can go away in the middle of a fine speech in order not to be late for a fine meal. He can leave an intellectual conversation which he otherwise enjoys in order to take his place at the gambling table. He can even repulse a poor man whom it's usually a joy to aid because he has only enough money in his pocket for a ticket to the theater. So the minute we start getting motivated by desires, we just think of, yes, intellectual conversations are wonderful way, and usually these are things that I find desirable, but what's the quicker way of getting pleasure? Maybe gambling or food or whatever it is, or going to the theater. So because with desire, what comes is this feeling of pleasure, or feeling of agreeableness, as he says. If the determination of the will, if how you decide what you're going to do rests on the feelings of agreeableness and disagreeableness, which he expects from any cause, it is the same to him through what kind of notion he's affected. The only thing then we end up considering when making a choice is how great, how long-lasting, how easily obtained, and how often repeated the pleasure, this agreeableness is, right? So the minute we start thinking about desire, that minute we start thinking about pleasure and agreeableness, and the only things that matter is how near, how easily obtained, how long will it last, what's the quantity of pleasure. That's what starts motivating us, rather than the higher and the lower. So all that distinction between higher and lower, reflected and unreflective, desire for the self, or none of that really has any sort of value, is what Kant is saying. Because when it comes to making a decision, you forget about, when it comes to deciding what you will do, you forget about those distinctions. What matters is what you can get. What you can get, and how quickly you can get it, and how long-lasting and how pleasurable it's going to be. So we should not let, pleasure even. So he makes the same point with gold. How does it matter where the gold comes from? It's the value of it, how it's mined, or whether it's picked up from the water or whatever. That's not the issue. The issue is what its value is. So he says, whether the ideas are from the sense, are from satisfying our sense organs, or the understanding, our rational capacity, he asks only how much and how real is the pleasure which they will afford him over the longest time. So both Kant and the Nyaya says, don't go in for this kind of distinction, because you won't be able to keep them apart. You won't be able to keep a distinction between desires, because what will matter is what the desires result in. So that's one reason not to be tempted by that kind of. So that's not what the Gita might be saying. Chakrabarti tries another thing, and tell me what you think about this. So, and it's also partly a Kantian thing. It's a very subtle psychological distinction, if you like, that Chakrabarti tries to make. So he says you do duty for the sake of duty. So deontology is what, duty for the sake of duty should be motivation. No other desire at all. Not even the desire for moksha. Not even let that, find a foothold in your psychology, so to say. But, he says, in addition to that, we have this belief, or in addition to that, we know that the way the world is, we will get happiness. We will get moksha. So it's not we are desiring moksha. The only thing is that I'm just giving you Chakrabarti's solution. So do duty for the sake of duty, he calls that act deontology. So what determines what you should do is duty for the sake of duty. But given the way our world is, and that's bringing in the telos, bringing in purpose, given the way, as a rule it happens, given the way our world functions, as a rule it happens that you will be rewarded with moksha. You will be rewarded with liberation. So Kant makes this distinction. Let me make the Kantian point, and then you can perhaps see it. So Kant says, the good man, or the the person, the moral person, is motivated by the right kind of intention. The right kind of intention is duty for the sake of duty, not because he's pursuing happiness. But, he gets happiness for free, because by doing duty for the sake of duty, you become worthy of happiness. And that's the reason why, the Hindus postulate karma theory. Kant postulates God. God ensures that the world is such that those who act, who are motivated just by the sense of duty are going to be happy. Happiness does not come by actively seeking it. So if you going home today and you help an old lady cross the road because you think this is going to make me happy, it's actually not going to make you happy, right? So the motivation should be, doing because it's a good thing to do, because it's my duty to do good things, to be motivated by that. If we are always pursuing, so Kant makes this point by giving you lots of examples. If you're always thinking of, happiness, you go to see a friend in hospital, right? And you think, if I go and see a friend in hospital, that will make me happy. And you go and do it for that reason. Kant says you were not going to get any happiness out of that. Or, because you won't be worthy of happiness. You have to do it because it's your duty to do it. You should visit your friends in hospital. There are all these Kantian oughts and shoulds that come in as to what one ought to do or what one... And then, it's as if you get happiness for free. You do your duty, you do a good act, and happiness comes for free. You just naturally, over a period of time, the message of the Gita is that you naturally become habitually the sort of person who does things because it is their duty to do those things, and you get moksha for free. Because that's the way the world is. You don't have to desire anything. You don't have to pursue happiness, Kant says. You become worthy of happiness. You don't have to pursue moksha. You get it. You do duty for the duty of sake, and you get it for free. Moksha comes for nothing. Is that a good solution? So what is doing the motivation? The motivation is just duty, not even the smallest, notion of desire. It's just because if you do that and you have the faith, Kant brings in faith. Hindus will bring in, faith in karma. Kant brings in faith in God. Bring in something like that, and you are reassured that moksha will come. You don't have to actively pursue it. You don't have to actively pursue happiness. So this is how he puts it. The Gita gives the factual assurance that the doer of virtuous deeds can never suffer any untoward consequence, but it does not. It does not even instruct the virtuous man to act for the sake of avoiding. You're not even acting for the sake of avoiding unpleasant consequences. You are just acting for the sake of duty. To appeal once again to the Kantian distinction that happiness is eventually granted to the virtuous man is a demand of pure practical reason, something that we can always hope for. So Kant says we can hope for it, but we cannot desire it. He's making this subtle distinction between desiring something and hoping something will result. But we can never, know it. And that's why the moral agent should never do his duties for the sake of happiness, but always from the pure motive of being worthy of happiness. What do you think? Is this a bit of wordplay? Replacing desire with hope? Or is there something to this solution? How many of you, think in your own psychology, sort of, can you distinguish between your desires and hopes? Is there a real sort of distinction between hoping for something? And think about doing the next exercise or hoping for a good mark as opposed to desiring a good mark. Is there a distinction there? Or are these philosophers doing more wordplay to confuse you? Worth thinking about, just Think about that thought for a minute. Is there a distinction there? Yeah?
I think in some ways, like, it has different connotations. So, like, if you hope for something, it's more of a positive or a thing. Like, it kind of is one of those things that tries to keep you out of feeling negative, feelings of negative thoughts. Whereas desires has normally got the connotation of going into negative thought or negative.
Right.
I'd see the
Good
word
point.
associated with the passive and the active almost.
Uh-huh.
If you hope for something, you're not going to necessarily be active in trying to make your hopes become a reality. With desire, it's often an active thing. You'll
Yeah.
pursue a desire, you won't pursue a hope, you have a hope, which is more passive.
Good, good.
So there is
That's
quite a big distinction.
that's very good too. And the negative and positive is also quite a good way of really trying to think whether there's a distinction between these two. Yeah.
I think with desires, you have an expectation, like, to get it, but with hope, you sort of just leave it up to
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of, with the negative point. If desires are not satisfied, there's disappointment. And that's one of the things that the next discussion will say about the nature of desire is that it, if it doesn't get, if it's frustrated, you're disappointed. There's something negative about it. Yeah, hope is just, passive, you're not actively working, so there's no disappointment. I hope that, there is no poverty in this world, but I'm not disappointed. I keep hoping, I keep doing little things to stop that, but, it's not that kind of disappointment. There's the active, passive, yeah?
If you know that you're going to get moksha if you work for duty safe, if you do your duty for duty safe, isn't hope kind of irrelevant? Because you know you're going to get it if you do it. So you don't need to.
That's a good point.
Suggests that it might not happen.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So there is, sort of knowledge is more than hope in some sense. And again, that's a good point. It kind of aligns with the other thing that, if you know, it's a fact about the world, I mean, like we know that snow is white or grass is green, you know that moksha, it doesn't, but if you know that moksha, isn't it motivating you to do duty for duty's sake? That's where it becomes a bit, this no thing, it's much stronger than hope. Why do you need hope? If I believe in karma, which is what motivates me to do duty for duty's sake, if I'm a Hindu, not a Kantian, then, I know this is going to be the result. But then the no seems, you having desire sneak in the back door, whereas with hope, the Kantian way of doing it, it doesn't quite. Yeah?
What if you know that your soul will achieve moksha, but you in this life won't? So you will do duty for duty's sake.
Yeah.
You won't realise it.
Yeah.
And there's no sense of it motivating you for this life. So because it's ambiguous,
Yeah.
it will happen sometime in the cycle, then it means that it can be both something that you know will happen and something that won't motivate you.
It couldn't be a motivating thing. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you're going to raise this now, so I don't want to, I guess there's the third solution, which is the one that I think makes the most sense, which is, like the kind of what he talks about at the end, which is simply that it's just not possible for you to supply kind of act for duty's sake, but in the same time just have an option like in the corner of your eye.
Peripheral vision.
That's like
Not focus on it, but
because the whole point what moksha gives you is that you don't it's the actual it's just doing acts for the sake of them, and you don't get happiness from the acts, you don't get pain, you just do them, and that is moksha. It's not that by doing that at some point you will get moksha. It's just that actual separating yourself from that is moksha.
Mhm.
So it's kind of an automatic process, and therefore it's impossible for you to kind of cheat your way through it.
Yeah. Good point. I will say, I'll come back to it and say something more about it. But I think, that's exactly what the Hindus are saying. But I think we need to add another twist there.
Oh, yeah, it kind of feels like it stops you from questioning, like, be in that mindset, you've got to be constantly present in what you're doing. But in a way, it stops you from questioning like why you're doing it. Like if you're doing something for beauty's sake, like then it kind of doesn't allow you to question why do you do it.
Yeah, yeah. It is kind of that, you know, sometimes you will, and I haven't read those passages in class, but sometimes in the Gita you do get this idea that, you know, you just do them habitually. You know, you do just actions out of habit, not because of thinking about them. You know, a good person, a virtuous person does duty and gets motivated just by that again, just out of habit, for no reason, for no further reason. And that's, you know, kind of the idea that it should be. The other thing that the Hindus built into this, and I think this gives a nice twist to the answer, is some of the Hindu schools, and not all of them, but some of the Hindu schools says moksha is not a pleasant state. Moksha is just the absence of suffering. So it's defined in this negative way. Moksha can't be something you desire, because anything you desire, you know, as we said, it makes you, when you get it, you're joyous. When you don't get it, you're disappointed. You know, that's the root cause. Desire is bound to pleasure. Desire is bound to agreeableness in this sort of way. And what the Hindus, what the Nyaya, one specific school of Hindus do, is they say, well, if you really want to make the ethics in the Gita consistent, what you need to do is to make moksha devoid of its positive value. It's just a neutral state. And what they, you know, here's how they describe it. This is the last paragraph on page 96. See, here's Vachaspati, you know, the Nyaya philosopher, makes it clear that for the genuine seeker of the ultimate good, that's moksha, it does not matter whether, for the genuine seeker, it does not matter whether there is positive permanent joy in that final state or not, because neither a violent, fiery aversion towards suffering and evils of the worldly existence, nor a passionate attachment to however pure or permanent or profound pleasure can be. So neither, you know, avoiding the sufferings in this earth, nor a passionate attachment to pleasure can be the right motive for moksha. A passionate search for happiness will bind the seeker into easier and closer sources of pleasure. So he thinks the only way of making the ethics of the Gita consistent is to take away the positive content, you know, not even describe the moksha in a positive way. It is completely neutral. And one of the, you know, one of the things, and again, you know, this is kind of an idea coming from all existence is bound up with suffering. One of the attitudes that the Nyaya philosophers say that you need to acquire is this, you know, just this disinterest. You know, this notion of not being interested in this world. It's kind of what they call detachment, not quite detachment. The Sanskrit word cannot be quite translated. Vairagya, which just means, you know, it's no more of all this. That's the best way, and Chakrabarti's way, not mine. The best way of thinking about Vairagya, or the attitude that one needs to establish, is no more of all this. You know, that's the only way. You have to go that far. You know, so you can think of this earthly existence as being, you know, this being on this ride. There are highs and lows, and ultimately, over a period of time, with very many births, you just get sick of these highs and lows. And then all, you know, you sort of want is not, you don't know what lies beyond. You know, you don't know what lies beyond, you know, whether that's happiness or not. But you just say, no more of all this. I'm sick of being on this roller coaster of pleasure and pain. That's the Hindu way of thinking about it. All earthly existence. I mean, Don't take it on board. I'm not suggesting no more of all this attitude at all. But that's one way. That's Chakrabarti thinks the way of making, making it consistent. It's taking away the positive content. Any reactions to that? Take away the positive content of moksha, make the ethics consistent? Is that a good solution? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah.
But if you just do it for you to say and keep doing things just to do them, then I guess that's a liberation aspect. Then you just liberate it. If you liberate yourself from pleasure, you liberate yourself from pain as well. So
Yeah, that's the idea.
it's a bit sad, I guess.
A bit sad.
I don't know. But
Yeah. Any other reactions to it? Anyone wanting to desire this kind of state?
Is it bound up, though, the idea of trying to fulfill different duties at different points in life? So when you said you shouldn't take some board, you shouldn't just join an ashram,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
forget
Yeah.
all this,
Yeah,
try
yeah.
to achieve moksha. That shouldn't happen
Yeah.
now, because we have our own set of duties at different ages and different points. So I can accept it if
It's much, much later in life.
a lot later down the line.
Yeah.
Because I think after a certain amount of time in life, you do get weary, and you do probably want to say no more than this.
Is that the wind?
The door does, isn't it?
Wow. I thought there was God or karma or someone walking in, but I think partly it is that, you're not supposed to be kind of thinking about vairagya, and, I guess old people sometimes say, they just want to die. I don't know. You might not have experienced it, but for, my grandparents' generation and all that, there is that, they just don't want to live anymore. You get to the stage in life. It's very difficult for us to understand, because we're much younger, but perhaps that happens. Don't know. It'll come. I don't know. Don't ask me difficult questions. All I want to say is about the solution. Well, maybe I should say two things and then quickly move on to one thing. This is not a question I am settled about, but sometimes I think the Kantian solution, without adding this Nyaya point about moksha not having any positive content, in some moods, on some days, in some years, I'm not saying I take this very flippantly. I think hard about it. Sometimes I'm convinced that solution works, and it's not just wordplay. And something you said earlier made me feel, the active-passive distinction got me in one of those moods where I start believing that there is something to the solution, and I must pursue it and probably write a paper on it. So I get this, and other times I feel it doesn't work. So this is an issue I've thought a lot about, but I don't have a settled answer. So if you ask me what is my view on the Kantian solution, the second solution, as Chakrabarti calls it, I don't have a fixed view. This year, I'm feeling positive that they can be pulled apart, the hope and the desire, and so I think something can be made of this distinction. At other times, I don't. So don't feel there is one right answer here. The other thing I want to say, and that's the last thing I want to say, is, but I do think adding on that Nyaya thing makes the solution very unattractive. It might make it consistent, and I think that's the point you were making, but it's not desirable anymore. I mean, what for? Why would one desire it, kind of, or, why would it be an attractive moral ideal at all? What would be the sort of pull of it? I don't understand. So I think, you get consistency. You certainly get consistency, I think, once you add in the Nyaya way of thinking about no more of all this attitude. But you get consistency at the cost of something. That's how I think about it. That, you know, you get consistency, but don't think, you know, you don't pay a very high price for it. The ideal almost becomes not something that you want to pursue. So a little more patience. Yeah?
So if you bypass some solution, do you have to believe, or you have to believe in the role of God, kind of giving it back to you? There's plenty of instances where you say, no, you know, you'll be a good person, but you're not going to get rewarded. And
Yeah.
the whole point is that you know you're not going to get rewarded. So you can't really, you know, expect some supernatural power to reward you for your good.
Yeah, I mean,
In that sense, it makes no sense. It's just, you don't need a reward. That's the whole
yeah.
joy of it.
You don't, yeah, you stop seeking an award. You get rid of, I mean, that's a good point, because Kant is forced to postulate God. You know, Kant starts off by questioning all of the metaphysical postulates. Don't ever read Kant. No, do, if you go on to doing graduate work in philosophy. But before that, I would say, you don't ever read Kant, because it's very difficult. But Kant does that, you know, sort of systematically, and he does away with the postulate of God. But then he thinks, you know, we need to bring it in. Otherwise, we cannot justify his moral edifice. You know, moral theory cannot be justified. And that's a very good question, you know. I mean, a good philosophical question is, why be moral? You know, why should one be moral at all? What's the motivation for being moral? We all know being moral is hard, right? Being a bad person is very easy. And the philosophical issue is, why be moral? You know, why should I follow what any moral theory says? After all, it's almost invariably says you'll have to give up a lot to be moral, you know. Stop buying yourself treats and give up money to Oxfam or whatever it is that you believe in. All sorts of things. We'll have to change our life a lot, by no matter which moral view we kind of. So the issue is, why be moral? And Kant's answer is, you can't answer this question unless you postulate God. You know, we are back to thinking about, you need a religious justification for morals. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, you know, but it is an issue to think about. Do we really need, and I'm not just saying a Christian God or this God or that God, but do we need a religious, some kind of faith coming in, faith in karma, as the Hindus had, or religious justification? Or we might say, you know, it's just a matter of you know, sort of disciplining oneself to not to want more of all this. Give me 5 more minutes. I just want to finish off this topic. But I do want to talk about the issue of, you know, is karma a desirable moral ideal next time? I want you to think about it a little bit. But let me just quickly say about the other thing, you know, desireless action. How do we even move without any kind of desire at all? Framren's solution, he takes that very, very seriously. He says, you know, this is a bit of conceptual analysis. There are 2 things about desire. One is that it motivates. 2, it is the sort of thing that disposes you to joy and disappointment. So these are the 2 features of desires. It motivates action, and it disposes you to joy and disappointment. But because of this second function, motivating you to joy and disappointment, it also, you know, has this effect that it binds you to pleasure. It binds you to want things that are pleasurable. What is the Gita trying to say? So he says, yes, we can have genuinely desireless action. And he says genuinely desireless action is, now he brings in this term that we all often use, it's my goal. He says, you know, some actions are not motivated by desire. They're motivated by goals. So think about someone whose goal is, you know, to do the Boston Marathon or something like that. They run every day. It's painful. They get no pleasure out of it. I have a friend who does that all the time, and I think, I should not say this, but I think his life is pretty meaningless. If, you know, he has to run to feel that he's got to... I have a friend who actually does that. It doesn't give him any joy. He's complaining every Saturday. Rings me up and tells me how awful the run was. and you know what happened and how many kilometers and how much time, etc. You have to again meet a certain standard to even qualify for those things. It's not giving him any joy at all, but there is a goal that is motivating him. So Fremrin, that's the kind of, Fremrin does it in the paper, if you read it, he does it with tax returns. Tax returns is something you do, and tax season is here, is something you do because you don't want to be penalized, right? You have a goal, gives you no joy at all, but, or, you know, it doesn't disappoint you when you've done your tax. Not one. I don't like his example. It doesn't work. I think the marathon example works better. You know, it's a goal into the future that's motivating you. Nothing, you know, in working towards, people have a goal to be fit. People have a goal to be a certain weight. You know, bring up your favorite thing. And so that's how Fremrin suggests we talk about desireless action by making this distinction between forget about desires, what motivates your actions or goals. Is that a good thing? Will that do the job? So he says, the Gita is saying you can do desireless action. Moksha can be a goal. Moksha is a goal. And working towards moksha is not going to be something you desire because it's not bound up with pleasure. Working towards moksha is bloody hard. That's very much the Hindu point. Working towards moksha is bloody hard, but we should still work towards it because it's a worthwhile goal to have. Is that a good solution? Very quickly, any responses? I've presented it very shortly, you know, just with one example, but succinctly, I must say, not too short. Does it work? Yeah?
If setting a goal is sort of like challenging yourself, then achieving that challenge satisfies you. And then how different is satisfaction from joy?
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
You know, this distinction actually might not be. And again, I mean, think about the whole thing about not being selfish, not having selfish desires, not wanting. So it's just giving up short-term fruits, but not giving up long-term fruits, right? Long-term fruits is what you want to achieve, and that's exactly your point. It will give you satisfaction. Even, you know, my useless friend who keeps talking about this running every Saturday and how much pain he has, you know, he's very pleased on the day. His timing is good. Even though he's far away from the goal yet, and it was a lot of pain. There's also a lot of excitement, so it's a sneaky solution, and it's also a very selfish solution. It's a sneaky solution, very good point, it's a selfish solution, and that doesn't quite fit well with moksha. But, you know, the point is just to make you see how hard this problem is, how hard people have struggled with this logical paradox, and this is one of your essay questions. So it's, you know, something I want you to keep thinking about through this course. Which way do you want to go, and how will you make a case for that? Okay, I'll leave you with that. We'll talk about desirability and do some Buddhist stuff next week. That'll be exciting. We'll move on. Something new.